Today's decision by the Ontario Court of Appeal is a win for the environment, it's a win for taking action on climate change, and it's a win for Canada both today and for future generations.
Ontario's top court says the federal government's carbon pricing plan is constitutional. Ontario launched a legal challenge of the law, saying a federally imposed carbon tax is an intrusion on provincial jurisdiction. But the Ontario Court of Appeal disagreed, saying today the federal government can legislate in relation to matters of national concern. Now, earlier this year, Saskatchewan also lost its legal challenge of the climate plan, but both provinces say they will take their cases to the Supreme Court. So what did today's ruling tell us about how that could play out? Joining me in studio now is Errol Mendez, who's Professor of Constitutional and International Law at the University of Ottawa. Professor Mendez, thank you for coming in today.
You're very welcome.
What's your reaction generally to the decision from the Ontario Court?
Well, when you combine it with the decision of the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, it's a very strong ruling for the federal government and its carbon tax, because to some extent the majority ruling supported the majority ruling in the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, and moreover the majority ruling in Ontario actually dismissed in some respects the concerns of the minority dissent in the Saskatchewan court. So when those go up to the Supreme Court of Canada, it's going to be a very strong set of rulings for the federal government.
Okay, hold on the Supreme Court part, because I want to ask you about this. It was not a unanimous ruling. It was a split decision.
Right.
What does that suggest to you?
Well, it was a 3-1 decision, so there was only one judge who was fully in dissent. And frankly, I'm not sure how substantive that dissent is.
Because Jason Kenney, for example, Premier of Alberta, looking at his own challenge there, looked at that and the split decision aspect of it, interpreting at it as a rejection of the federal government's use of sweeping powers.
Well, let's take that, because one of the parts of the dissent's ruling, which I found, frankly, quite surprising, was that he claimed that the federal government's position that this was such a national concern for reduction of greenhouse gases that it could be applied to things such as home heating or improvements in energy efficiency. What we lawyers would call that type of reasoning a reductio ad absurdum. It's not likely that a federal government is going to regulate home heating.
He also said, in the dissenting opinion, he included a warning about not allowing rhetoric to color constitutional analysis. What do you make of that?
Well, again, I actually know a little bit about the background of Justice Hashcroft, and he comes from what is called, in constitutional theory, he's an originalist, which likes to view the terms of a constitution in very specific, narrow terms. And frankly, I think that's not in accord with, frankly, what our Supreme Court, and indeed what we received from the Privy Council before the Supreme Court took over, is the view of our Constitution as a living tree, which goes beyond just technical boundaries of reasoning in these very important decisions.
Okay. So as we look to the future then, we know Manitoba is looking at this same matter, challenging this same issue in court. Alberta challenging similarly. But what we've seen so far, as you say, both in Ontario and Saskatchewan, the courts have been clear that the federal government did not overstep in its jurisdiction.
Right.
So why proceed?
Well, I think you should look to see why is Alberta even starting the process for its Court of Appeal. And that tells me that a lot of this is political maneuvering, because even if these rulings are going against these governments, they want to be seen to their constituents, the ones who agree with them that there should be no carbon tax, that they are doing something in addition to these rulings being decided against them. So unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of this. We're seeing, for example, the same type of political positioning with the courts between Alberta and British Columbia in terms of, if you like, turning off the taps.
Well, that was in court today, as a matter of fact.
Exactly. I think Alberta knows that it'll be struck down. It is clearly unconstitutional. You cannot discriminate against provinces in the export of your natural resources. And frankly, again, BC has now been confirmed that its ability to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline is not going to go much further. So there's a lot of maneuvering in terms of politics, but in terms of law, it's starting to become very clear.
From Saskatchewan, we know that they are going to take their case to the Supreme Court. They expect it will be heard in December. Ontario announcing very quickly today that losing today, it will appeal.
That's correct.
So when this matter gets to the top court in this land, based on what we've seen in the opinions
Right.
and what you understand, what do you think the Supreme Court is likely to do?
I think it's quite clear that with two very strong majority rulings, that there is very little chance that the decisions of the Court of Appeals of two major provinces will be overturned by the court. What I think is concerning, at least to me, was if that is the understanding of all the experts, and keep in mind, even Manitoba at one stage had a legal opinion which says don't even go much further because it's not going to be decided in your favor. And that concerns me because what are the costs involved in terms of moving all these appeals up to the Supreme Court of Canada? And not just legal costs. I'm talking about what economists call opportunity costs. At the same time as we're pushing these appeals through, there's some major issues happening here in Ontario. For example, you may have heard that there's been a massive cut in legal aid in Ontario. So we're pushing money into appealing things which perhaps everyone knows is not going to be successful, whereas we have now large parts of the Ontario population which may not have access to justice. So that to me talks about this opportunity cost involved in extending these appeals to the Supreme Court of
And
Canada.
the political agendas that you referred
Exactly.
to earlier. Thanks so much for coming in, helping us understand this better.
You're very
I appreciate
welcome.
it. Professor Earl Mendez here with me in studio from the University of Ottawa.
Today's judgment, confirming the constitutionality of the federal government's approach to pricing carbon pollution, is good news for every Canadian who believes that climate action is urgent and that smart solutions can make the planet safer and our economy stronger too.
There is the Federal Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, as she took to Facebook today to react to the favorable court decision on her government's carbon tax. The Ontario Court of Appeal ruled that Ottawa is within its legal rights to impose a tax on the country's largest province. Last month, Saskatchewan's appeal court also upheld the federal government's carbon pricing law. So how will this latest ruling play into the heated political debate over the legitimacy of a federal carbon tax? That leads us into round two of the Power Panel. Jen, Marty, and Marie all still with me. And Marie, I'll let you pick up. As I said, for Saskatchewan, now Ontario, here we have the second court decision to go against the provinces in as many months. As our constitutional professor was saying just a few minutes ago, it is clear the federal government has jurisdiction. Does this put an end to the political debate over carbon taxes?
I feel like Marty wants to jump in. Political, no. Legal, perhaps. It's not very surprising given that the arguments on both sides were the same. The province, this time Ontario, saying Ottawa is overstepping by regulating a tax to attack climate change and GHG emissions. Ottawa saying they're entitled to because it's a national concern. I did find this ruling was even more categorical than the Saskatchewan one in siding with the federal government. The Ontario Court of Appeal saying, well, Ontario did sign up to a pan-Canadian framework at first, so that kind of proves that it's a national concern. They agreed with it, and Ontario never brought up any provincial laws that were infringed upon by this federal regulation. Hence, this does still allow ample room for provincial jurisdiction. It begs the question, though, now that you have two cases of precedent saying the same thing, whether this should maybe just be left to the Supreme Court at this point. Alberta still wants to go ahead with their own contestation or their own argument at their own Court of Appeal. But New Brunswick is already saying, well, you know what, maybe we should stop throwing money out the window and just focus on Saskatchewan going to the Supreme Court and Ontario now and just make our arguments there instead of, taking up another case in a Court of Appeal. Ultimately, the Supreme Court will decide if these rulings were correct or not, and if the federal government is allowed to go ahead or not. But it's definitely a huge win for Justin Trudeau and the Liberals going into an election. It doesn't take away the political argument of whether you should impose a tax or a price on carbon and whether it should be imposed on consumers, even though they get cash back.
Right.
But it does allow at least the Liberals to say, well, we're allowed to do it.
And hold on to the thought about election. Marty, I'll come back to you on that in just a second. But Marie also raised Alberta. And as I look at Premier Kenney's statement after this, Jen, quite interesting because he talks about how this decision today from Ontario, the application to Alberta remains to be seen because Alberta did not intervene in the Ontario case. And he's also heartened by the split decision of this court. He's vowing to go ahead with Alberta's court challenge this fall. So what are you expecting from him?
Oh, there's no planet in which Alberta stays out of this fight. I mean, for so many reasons. I mean, they campaigned on fighting this carbon tax in court. It is absolutely expected of him, the end of his base, that they will launch another spear into this particular dragon in the hopes that they manage to catch it in the eye. That being said, will it work? Well, I don't know. You know, first when I was you know, writing and researching about the carbon tax challenge, I was like, oh, this is all just partisan politics. This is all just, you know, politicians trying to appeal to their bases with a hopeless anti-carbon tax case that would fall apart. And when I started talking to some people who were experts in this field, and not people who were partisan or conservative by any stretch, they were like, like, you know, I've heard odds as high as like 50-50 that actually the courts would shut down a federal backstop program, and I was kind of amazed by that. But what we've seen in these rulings is that they're actually pretty split rulings, and it's 3-1. 4-1, you're correct, and also 3-2 in the Saskatchewan case. And the Saskatchewan case is the one which I believe is going to be heard by the Supreme Court. And what's interesting to me is that the only people who are really dealing with the jurisdictional issues that the provinces are bringing up appear to be the dissenters. So you know, it's or dealing with them in a very serious way. So, you know, would I put odds on the Supreme Court, you know, ruling against the carbon tax? No, I wouldn't put high odds on it. I think that there's a pretty good chance that the Supreme Court will fall in line with what the provincial courts have ruled. But I also wouldn't totally rule it out either. I don't think that it is entirely as lost a cause as people who just want to chalk this up to populist politics would like it to be.
And I would add really quickly, what will be interesting is that Manitoba's case is not the same as Ontario's arguments and Saskatchewan's and Alberta's. They have, instead of a constitutional argument, they have more of an administrative argument. And so in the federal court, that will be interesting to see. Could that maybe change the outcome of the decision?
Right. And as far as politics to all of this, Marty, last word to you. And again, we just heard from Catherine McKenna there in her Facebook statement, but as I look at her written statement, it's also interesting. And let me just quote from it. It's unfortunate that Conservative politicians, including Doug Ford and Jason Kenney, supported by Andrew Scheer, so coming to the federal level, supported by Andrew Scheer, continue to waste taxpayers' dollars fighting climate action in court rather than taking real action to fight climate change. This fall, Canadians will get their chance to reject the approach of Conservative politicians. How do you expect this issue will play out during the campaign?
I expect to hear a lot more of what Catherine McKenna said for a very, very simple reason, is that she wants to hitch this, rightfully, I think, to the fact that Andrew Scheer supports this effort in general and has, you know, come out in support of Doug Ford in particular. And I mentioned Doug Ford not only because it is of the vast, you know, plethora of votes that is Ontario, but it's governed by Doug Ford, who is supremely unpopular right now. That unpopularity, I don't think, is as important as other people have been saying for Doug Ford himself. It is massively important for the Conservative government. So you're going to see a lot of this sort of almost triangulation of them trying to hook this into not necessarily, you know, the other quote unquote other provinces, but concentrating on Ontario for that very reason. The other interesting thing that's going to be coming up in September is the fact that according to the TMX, the TMX pipeline is going to be going shovels in the ground in September. People that come out and say, well, the carbon tax is killing jobs and Justin Trudeau doesn't want anything to do with oil. Well, that's the counter argument. This is lining up extremely, extremely well for Justin Trudeau. The last thing I would point out here is that, you know, SNC-Lavalin and the scandal surrounding SNC-Lavalin basically occupied my life for about 2.5 months. Probably everybody on this panel. I would argue that we have not been saying a peep about this in a long time, and that we're hearing nothing about the fact that Justin Trudeau is winning on many different fronts right now.
Okay. The last note on which to conclude today. Thank you so much for all of that. As always, our Power of Panelists very much appreciate your insight. Jan Gerson, Marty Patriquin, and Marie Vastel with us tonight. Thanks. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Kapelos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.